Hello and welcome to History of Art 1, Prehistory to Medieval, FINA H111, presented by Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne. My name is Dr. Aaron Schwartz, and this is week 14 of our semester, and our topic for this week is Late Medieval Italy. So in this chapter, we'll be focusing on the Italian peninsula. And that's because in the Middle Ages, Italy develops regional cultures that will be fairly distinctive from the rest of Europe in the north. So we're going to be jumping around different locations in Italy and seeing how this late medieval period develops, which will set the foundation for the Renaissance, which we will not cover in this course, but will be in the next sequence of courses. What we're going to notice throughout this time period and really developing in the Italian kingdoms and republics is this interest in the idea of humanism and individualism within the art and literature of this time. Also, in terms of religion, we still, of course, have the Catholic Church in Rome that will be very important to the development of the region. Although eventually the papacy, because of some of the instability, political, military instability in the regency, the papacy will have to move out of Italy to Avignon and will begin to shift some of the power within the peninsula itself. So there's a lot happening here, a lot of movement of power and art and money around the peninsula. Also related to the church are the development of religious orders or mendicants, the Dominican order, which primarily will base itself on the study of classical texts, will be established in 1216. Just before that, however, are the Franciscans, who will concentrate very much on the idea of communing with nature and being one with nature and beauty, will be established in 1209. Both the Dominicans and the Franciscans will use imagery to communicate their ideas. So along those lines, let's take a look at a Franciscan image in the next slide. So what we're looking at here is a Franciscan image. This is a panel from the St. Francis altarpiece, and it dates to about 1235. It's tempera on wood, and it's about 5 feet tall, so it's not a little piece here. What we're going to start to notice in some of these works is a combination of that Byzantine-era flat, stylized approach to the figure, combined with increased sense of classicism. And you can begin to see that here with Francis. First of all, let's note how the scene is composed. St. Francis is in the very center of the composition. He's also the largest figure in the composition. So hierarchy of scale is something we're already pretty familiar with, and we've seen this across the millennium that we've been looking at in our class. So we have him centrally located in a hierarchy of scale. We then see scenes of his life on either side of him, and then a couple of angels. We'll notice that the scenes from the life of St. Francis sort of spelled out for us like a picture book to let us know the important parts of his life and his ministry there. We'll notice that Francis is facing us, and he's presenting his hands to us and his feet to us in a way that we can see the wounds, the stigmata wounds on his hands and feet. That's going to help us clearly identify this as Francis and his importance as a figure. Now, a tension that we're going to see throughout this entire lecture is this tension between classicism and humanism, and that medieval Byzantine instinct to abstract. And we're going to see these artworks start to go back and forth. Some will very much embrace that Byzantine style abstraction and flattening of the figure, which we see quite a bit in this piece. Other pieces will begin to embrace a much more naturalistic, classic form of representation in the human body. Now, because of that artwork of this time period and of this place is not really cohesive. You're going to see many different styles at once. What's really exciting about that is that we're looking at artwork in evolution. We're seeing how the figure, how the form is evolving from a medieval style into something that will be very much akin to a Renaissance style. We're watching the evolution happen here. So if it seems, as you're looking at these images and you're reading the book, if it seems inconsistent, if it seems like, wow, some of these artists are really abstract and some of these artists are really naturalistic and they're so different from each other, that's because we're seeing, as a culture, these people working through these ideas and starting to gain footing and trying to figure out what the next step in their artwork is going to be. So to help us understand this evolution of style from a medieval style into something closer to a Renaissance style, from going from that Byzantine influence to a more classical influence, we're going to take a look at a lot of different images, so we're going to do some comparisons. And I'm going to do something a little bit different this week. Instead of just trying to give you so much of the backstory and the dates and the political aspects of it, we're going to focus a lot more on style and what this means in terms of how the artwork looks and how it's composed. And I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions and asking you to pick things out of the scene. Now, obviously, this is a video and I can't hear your responses, so I'm going to ask you to answer questions in your notes and sort of consider things that way. And even though it's a little bit one way, and I wish there was more direct interaction here, I do think that playing along with me, answering the questions and so on, will really help you understand this material better and what's going on in this time frame. So with that in mind, let's look at this piece by Nicola Pisano, The Annunciation and the Nativity. This is from a baptistry in the pulpit of Pisa, carved out of marble. This particular section is about 2'10" by 3'9", so it's not a huge sculpture, but it's a considerable piece of marble. So what I'd like you guys to do is really look at this, because there are several scenes happening at once within here. Now I'd like you to consider, as you look at this scene, what is the focal point? So consider what you would define as the focal point. Why do you think that is the focal point? And this is something I want you to do in your notes. And pause this video if you have to. This image is in your book. Look at it in your book. But try to figure that out. And then try to look at the different scenes that are being presented and how they unfold around this figure. Next, I'd like to consider the space. Is there any depth here? Do you see any perspective here? How are these figures relating to each other in terms of spatial relationship? So I'm asking you in your notes to sort of break this down in terms of composition. And this is something that in previous lectures I would have just done and sort of explained as we looked at it, but I'm hoping that at this point, this is our 14th week, that you guys are able to see these things for yourselves and can begin to describe some of this yourself. So take a few moments to consider that here and write down some ideas, and then we'll take a look at the next image. Now that you've taken some time to look at that previous piece by Nicola Pisano, look at this one by Giovanni Pisano. It portrays all of the same scenes and very close to the same kind of order and composition. But I'm hoping, as you look at this, you'll see that it's very dramatically different than the one we just looked at. So again, I'm not going to hold your hand and walk you through this, but I'd like you to really take a few moments to look at it. And again, I believe this one is also in your book. Really look at it and answer what seems like a simple question. How is this different from the one we just looked at. Take a couple of moments to sort of sort out how this strikes you at first glance as being different. Here are those two images again, side by side, and I'm hoping this juxtaposition will help us understand the trend that art is taking during this time. So they both portray the same basic set of imagery. There's an Annunciation, a Nativity, all of this stuff going on here. Now, as you guys probably, I'm hoping you picked up on, in the very center of both of these works is an image of the Virgin Mary. So in the upper left, the one by Nicola Pisano, we see Mary is the largest figure in the composition. We're using a hierarchy of scale. Just over her shoulder, her left shoulder, our right, to the very right of Mary, you see the baby Jesus in the manger. Look at the relationship between Mary and Jesus. And I mean actually their physical relationship. Are they connected to each other? Does there seem to be any sort of emotional attachment there? And the spatial relationship. How are these figures interrelated to each other within the space? And then look at the image on the right, the Giovanni Pisano sculpture. Again, Mary is in the very center of the composition, and Jesus is just to our right of Mary. But you can see that it's composed in a radically different way. First of all, in this scene, although the proportions are not quite right in the scene, and some figures are bigger than others, they're not quite as exaggerated. And Mary's presence is she's larger than other figures, but it's not quite as exaggerated as it is in the other one. Notice also the way Mary in this one reaches for the baby Jesus. The way she pulls the blanket up over her, she reaches out for the infant. We actually have a physical and through that an emotional connection between these two figures that seems to be lacking in that first piece. Now, what we're seeing in this demonstration, and by the way, this is something I love to do, to put these figures right up next to each other and just sort of compare them one to one. And when we have figures that are the same images by two different artists, that's a wonderful way to try to understand it. The evolution from the image on the left with the static, heavy line, Byzantine-style abstraction, passive faces, and poses, that sort of evolution that we see on the left will eventually, culturally, overall, begin to evolve into something more akin to what we see on the right, where these figures are not completely realistic and not completely proportioned, but we're seeing an evolution, we're seeing a step, where we see lots more curvilinear shapes, rounded figures. We see how figures interact with each other in slightly more naturalistic ways. And we're beginning to see the development of humanism, individuality, and emotion coming back into these figures. It's both, when you put them side by side, it's both sort of easy to see that evolution, but you also begin to appreciate that it's still subtle. There's a subtle evolution happening here. And I'm hoping as we move through this week's lecture, you'll begin to see what I'm talking about. This is a very difficult chapter to discuss, and it's a difficult thing to sort of put your finger on. What we're talking about is the transition between the medieval era to the Renaissance era. We're a little bit handicapped in this class because we're not actually going to talk about the Renaissance in this class. History of Art 2 picks up just before the Renaissance. So it's an awkward sort of transitionary period because we can see the evolution beginning, but we're just going to be a little short of getting there in this particular unit, in this particular chapter. But in my opinion, and this is just my take on the material, I find this to be really exciting. Once we see how artists are exploring these ideas, trying to bring that humanism back into artwork and trying to bring that emotion and humanity back into these pieces after it's been absent from religious art for so long. So here's a piece done by the artist Giotto di Bondone. In art history, we typically just refer to him as Giotto. And he's working during this time period in Florence. He's a Florentine painter. And as we take a look at this Madonna enthroned, we'll want to consider, again, this evolution of style. And we can see in this piece both a lot of Byzantine medieval influences and an element of classicism coming back into the scene. So we see that flat golden background and these flat golden halos and sort of this odd mystical representation of space. We also see we have a Mary and Christ enthroned, but we have a little bit of three-dimensionality in the enthronement space that they're in, just a bit of perspective. We see that Mary has a nice sense of volume and scale to her, as Christ does as well. So we're seeing a bit more volume-esque space and modeling and those sorts of classical stylistic elements again being brought into the scene. And how they're both being combined here in this piece by Giotto. Giotto himself was quite famous in his own time. He's a well sought after and highly respected artist. And we'll take a look next at a few pieces from his artwork in the Arena Chapel. This is a scene from the Arena Chapel in Padua, Italy, and I'm not going to talk too much about this particular slide, but I wanted to give you guys a sense of where the paintings are located. You can see it's a long hallway here, and you can see a program of paintings on the left and right on the side walls. We're going to be taking a look at a couple of those images, those smaller panels on the wall. So this is a scene from that chapel. This is the Lamentation from Arena Chapel. So you can see that it's a smaller program. I hate to call it a small painting. It's over 6 feet wide. But you saw sort of its location there in the overall hallway. So really take a look at this. And again, I don't want to hold your hand through this. I want you guys to really take a moment and look at what Giotto is doing here. These elements of classicism to help you out and to help you understand what I'm asking you to look for. In your notes, as you look at this, answer these questions for me. How are the figures being portrayed? Do they look Byzantine or not? What is the focal point here? Where is the focal point in this scene? How would you describe the composition of the scene? Is it symmetrical, asymmetrical? Is it weighted to one side or the other? What is the emotional content of the scene? Is this a happy painting, a sad painting? How do you tell that? How can you tell that scene? How would you describe the way the bodies are portrayed here, the human figures? Are they flat, abstracted? Are they rounded, volume-esque? So this is the type of language I want to get you thinking about as you look at these figures. More of a formalistic description of the picture plane and the scene. And really, guys, I want you to participate in this. Really think about what Giotto is doing here. And I'm hoping that over the past 13 weeks you guys have heard me talk enough about how the figures are made and the composition of the piece that you should be able to do some of this and write some of this down on your own. What we're looking at with Giotto is this idea of a proto-Renaissance, and a lot of the classical elements that will be much more common in the Italian Renaissance we see the foundations of them here in Giotto's scene, in this Lamentation, and it's a beautiful, expressive scene. So again, take a few moments and write down some descriptions and try to figure out what Giotto is doing here and what makes it different, what sets it apart from that earlier Byzantine and medieval stuff that we've looked at in weeks past. Now this is a different artist, Duccio, and he's again an artist that art historians tend to refer to by one name. So Duccio gives us this Virgin and Child enthroned with saints. It's quite a marvelous piece, and it's a really large piece. It's 13 feet long. One will notice with Duccio, although he's painting at roughly the same time as Giotto, Duccio is over in Siena, and he's going to develop a style that's a little bit more Gothic, and a little bit more reliant on that Gothic and even earlier Byzantine tradition. So again, I'm going to ask you to look at this piece, and what makes this piece more Gothic than the Giotto piece? How would you compare the Giotto painting with this painting? And obviously they're very different scenes, they're different materials, but putting that aside, just the style and composition here are quite different between the two. So consider that for a moment and jot down some ideas. Here's another Duccio painting, a betrayal of Jesus, and what we're going to look at here is again his maybe more Gothic kind of style in his approach to the scene. Now there's a lot going on in the scene. At the center, you see the figure of Jesus Christ. You can identify him. He's got the big halo. There seems to be a mob of people behind him, and then there's a figure that has come up to Jesus and is giving him a kiss. So the story, this is the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. So Jesus is in the red cloak there with the halo. Judas is in the greenish and orange cloak, kissing him. And the reason that Judas is kissing him is that this was the sign that he was going to use to identify Christ so that the Roman soldiers, and you can see them in the background, knew who to arrest. So this is the moment where Judas finally betrays Jesus, and he's about to be arrested by the guards. You'll notice that all of the other followers of Jesus are reacting in various ways. They're either denying that that's Jesus, or they're trying to fight the guards. You'll notice on the left-hand side, the white-haired man with the green and blue has pulled a knife and is cutting the ear off of somebody to our left. The man with the knife is Peter, and there is that story that's told that in the tumult after the betrayal, Peter was so upset he pulled a knife and he cut a guy's ear off. So we have that detail in there too. So there is an element here. Duccio wants us to understand that this is that biblical scene. This is that passage. And I want you guys again to sort of figure out compositionally what he's doing here, and what he's trying to portray and how he's trying to portray it. It's a very busy scene. There's lots of lines and colors and moving back and forth. It's very linear. You'll notice lots of sharp lines and creases in the robes. And we'll notice the way that figures overlap each other in kind of in a rigid manner. So again, to demonstrate this evolution that we're seeing in different parts of Italy, we're going to compare this to a Giotto scene of the same moment in biblical story. So here's Giotto's portrayal of that same scene, and this is also from the Arena Chapel, where we saw the Lamentation. So we're going to see all of the prerequisite elements. Jesus with his halo, Judas giving Christ a kiss to identify him. We see the mob of people in the background. We see people holding sticks and torches, and we see the confusion and the chaos wrapping around the scene. And yet there's something really different about the way that Giotto presents the scene to us. And there's something classical both in the portrayal of the human bodies and the volume, the way he overlaps and presents a sense of space, and also the emotional content of the piece. So again, I want you, the students, to try to articulate what Giotto is doing and how he's interpreting this scene, and why you think he might want to interpret it in this way, as opposed to what we saw with Duccio. So here's another comparison. There's Duccio's betrayal of Jesus, and there's Giotto's betrayal of Jesus. And a nice little side-by-side comparison so we can try to understand this difference and these differences. So we'll notice that the Duccio style, again, has a certain Gothic or Byzantine element to it in its composition and how he's treating the space and the figures. But we'll notice Giotto is doing something quite different. His figures have a very different character to them. The way they seem to come forward and recede into space is quite different. And again, the emotional context of these images is quite different. And pay attention to the relationship between Judas and Jesus. This is the exact same moment in the story portrayed here, where Judas kisses Jesus to identify him to the Romans. And yet we'll see in the Duccio on the left, it's presented rather matter-of-factly. Jesus is completely seen to us. We see his entire body. He's clearly identified to us. And Judas leans in. Christ does not look surprised. He does not look shocked, maybe a little sad. But we see it presented as a sort of matter-of-fact, like we were having the story read to us, and then this happened. And we see it sort of matter-of-fact, here's that moment in the story. That's very different from how Giotto presents the scene on the right. The exact same moment. This is the moment that Judas has chosen to betray his friend Jesus. You notice that Jesus' form, his body, is almost completely obscured. We see Judas wrapping this golden cloak around his friend to identify him to the Roman soldiers. We see in this scene, in Giotto's interpretation, the two men face each other. They look each other in the eye. And I think that's a very powerful, dramatic moment, and very key to understanding the difference between these two paintings, between these two depictions of the scene. Because Duccio on the left presents the scene as a sort of educational matter of fact. And then Judas betrayed Jesus. And then this happened. And here we see it executed in what happens as part of the aftermath. In Giotto's scene on the right, we're really playing up the drama of this betrayal. These two men knew each other, they were friends, they were companions, and this is a personal, emotional betrayal, where this moment, right up until the moment before he identifies Christ, Judas could choose not to do it. But at some moment he had to make the choice, and this is when he does so. And he doesn't sneak in and just try to identify Christ and run away. He embraces him, he embraces his choice, and he looks him in the eye, and Christ looks Judas in the eye and acknowledges, yes, you have betrayed me, this is happening. So it's a much more personal moment. It's a much more human moment, the way Giotto presents the scene, and that's the key here. Obviously, the stylistic differences, the way the bodies are presented, the space, the twisting motion, those are quite apparent to us as we look at these scenes. At least I hope they're apparent to you if you take the time to look at the way the paintings are created. But also of importance is the emotional characteristic of these paintings. Not just the literal story being told, but the human story being told. And that the fact is, as we move forward and get closer to the Renaissance, we will see artists developing a greater interest in telling the human story, the humanity, the emotional elements, the individual moments that make up these stories and that make up these characteristics. That's going to be a key difference in the meaning between these kinds of images. So I'd like you guys to consider that and consider this comparison and contrast and the different functions of the pieces and how these artists, who again are working at roughly the same time, but in different cities, how they're developing these different motifs, these different styles, and what they're drawing upon. So we have Duccio's more Gothic, more medieval sort of rigidity and composition in his work. And then we have Giotto bringing this classicism, even maybe Hellenistic elements into his work on the right. So really consider this piece and try to jot down in your notes how these pieces are different both stylistically and in terms of emotional content in your own words. How would you describe the differences between these works? So this is a work also being done in Florence, but you'll see it has quite a different look to it. An Annunciation altarpiece, large scale, well over 10 feet wide, tempera and gold leaf on wood. Really spectacular piece. This is an Annunciation done in about 1333. And again, you're going to see that combination of Byzantine elements and more classical elements being brought in here. That's a beautiful golden frame laid over the top of the panel, giving it a certain three-dimensionality. But again, I want you guys to consider the depth, the way the bodies are modeled, and the emotional reactions of the characters in the scene. So in the middle panel, we have an angel on the left kneeling down, speaking the Annunciation to Mary, who's sitting in a chair on the right. And if you look closely, you can see that words are coming out of the angel's mouth and reaching Mary's ear. So we see the text of the Annunciation itself reaching Mary. So we have the spectacular, miraculous event of an angel appearing before Mary, telling her, announcing to her that she is going to bear the Christ child. And then we have Mary's reaction. Now, how would you typify Mary's reaction here? How would you describe her reaction to this news from the angel? Because there's something very specific being communicated here. In a previous lecture, we spent a fair amount of time looking at Gothic cathedrals and talking an awful lot about architecture. I'm not going to go into that kind of depth about architecture here. I'll just show you this image of this in Siena. And I'll let you guys, as you read the book and as you reflect upon what you saw last week and the past couple of weeks with medieval architecture, you can begin to see the progression here and how this is quite different from some of the Gothic cathedrals and so on we've looked at before. This, I should point out, is not a cathedral. It's a palazzo pubblico, so it's a public palace, a public area square. So it has a different kind of function. And you're going to see that the development of architecture itself is going to develop differently because of that. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about the structure, about the outside of this. We'll take a look at some of the decoration found inside. Inside that building we just looked at is a very large mural. And we're just looking at one half of it here. And we'll take a look at the next half in the next slide. But this entire piece is called The Effects of Good Government in the City and in the Country. And what we're looking at here is the peaceful city. Now, this is kind of unusual for us because this is not explicitly a religious scene. There's no Jesus Christ, there's no Annunciation, there are no saints in here. This is secular. So it's been a while since we've seen non-religious images, so that's different for us here. It's a very large-scale fresco, and the entire idea behind this is to represent the effects of good government. So this is in essentially a government building. And you could think of it as a way of communicating the idea, why should we participate in government? Why do we need to pay taxes? Why do we need to obey the laws of government? Well, this is why, so that we can have a peaceful city, a bustling city. And that's what we see portrayed here. We see male and female figures, noble figures, merchant figures, different social strata coming in and out of the city, participating in the marketplace and in trade. Everyone's getting along with each other. Everyone's able to come and go freely without fear. And we see that. And we see the multiple storied buildings, the houses, the businesses, and the banks and public spaces. We see all of those sort of stacked on top of each other. So we really get the sense of a populated urban environment where everyone is obeying the laws and obeying the rules, and that we have this peaceful harmony and movement within the city that's very dramatic and very vibrant, that it's a living city with lots of people in it. There's some wonderful little details in this. I won't try to spell them all out for you, but do take some time to look at the details of this painting. There's some really just nice treatments of the figure and of space. And again, I'd like you to consider how Lorenzetti, the artist here, is creating a sense of space. As we look at the scene, we'll notice that in terms of one-point perspective, of linear perspective, this is a little bit awkward. And if you look at the lines of the buildings, how they recede into space, the angles, there's a little bit of awkwardness, the way the buildings overlap each other, and how the lines don't quite add up to a rational recession into space. And I'd caution you, though, not to just sort of wave that off as, well, the artist didn't know how to use perspective correctly, because there's something to the way Lorenzetti has presented the scene that sort of draws our eyes into it. And the colors and the line work and the patterning and the groups of people here and there really create a kind of visual energy that draws you into the piece and moves you around the piece, almost like you are sojourning through the city itself, increasing the movement and vitality of it. But this is just the city side. We'll look in the next slide, we'll take a look at the country side. So this is the peaceful country just outside of the peaceful city. And on the very left-hand side of the fresco, you can see just a remnant of the city wall there. So this is a very lovely scene where we see people coming in and out of the city gates, and we see the rolling countryside and farmland. And this too has lots of really nice little details. You can see the farmers, you can see the country people out there living and working on the land. You can see merchants and people coming and going across the roads to access the city. And again, very much the same idea as the city side of the painting. The idea is that government and good government bring order and peace to the city, that we can have that thriving urban community inside the city walls because we have the support of the country, and the country people have the peace of mind to be able to farm their land and participate in trade peacefully because they have the protection of the city and the government. So it's a symbiotic relationship. The two need each other to persist and to thrive and to grow. We'll notice that in the city scene we have a predominance of cool colors, while in in the country scene we have a predominance of cool colors, whereas in the city scene we had lots more warm pastel colors. So we see a bit of a contrast there that's telling us something perhaps about the difference between how people perceive city life and country life. We see, of course, all of these wonderful natural scenes as opposed to all of the architecture. And there's a little bit more distance in the country scene. Obviously, Lorenzetti wanted to give us a sense of the scope and the scale of Siena and its surrounds here. So it's not we don't see quite as much detail and quite as many people sort of interacting with each other. We see people instead scattered throughout the countryside, and we get much more of a sense of the multitudes of people and the vast amounts of land required to support a big, bustling, prosperous city like Siena. So with this image, we're moving back to Florence, and we're taking a look at the Florence Cathedral. And again, I'm hoping as you look at this, you'll be struck at how different this looks from the Gothic cathedrals that we looked at last time in France. This was begun in 1296, and it takes quite a while to complete. The dome, which is really spectacular and quite an amazing feat of engineering, dates to a slightly later time, as does the tower here. But if you look at just the main body of the church, the main nave here, we'll notice, first of all, in terms of scale, it is immense. It's a very large structure. But obviously our treatment of it, of the exterior space, the use of windows, the architectural supports, the exterior decoration, we're doing something really, really different here than we saw with some of those French and German Gothic cathedrals. So definitely a different attitude about the construction of the sacred space here. Now I'm not going to say too much more about this cathedral, because if you go on to FINA H112, History of Art 2, you'll hear the instructor talk much more about the construction of that dome and some of the engineering that went into the construction of the space. So I'm not going to belabor too much of that point here. But let's take a look at the inside. Here we are looking at the nave of the Florence Cathedral, looking towards the east. And again, I'm just going to ask you guys a series of questions and see if you can articulate what I'm trying to get at and some of the differences that we're seeing. Because this evolution of style isn't just about the painting and those kinds of works. It's also extended to the architecture. And we're going to be moving away from a Gothic aesthetic into a Renaissance aesthetic. And we can see the beginnings of that type of transition here in the Florence Cathedral. There are many ways in which the nave of the Florence Cathedral looks very similar to the nave of some of those French Gothic cathedrals that we saw last time. But, as I'm hoping you're seeing, there are also many ways that this is very different. So take a look at this and think back to those Gothic cathedrals, and I'd like you to consider and try to articulate in your notes how this building is different from a Gothic cathedral. And also, what similarities does it have in common with a Gothic cathedral? Think about the size. Think about the vertical space. Think about the architectural elements, the arcade, the ribbed vaulting, the pointed arches. How is light getting into here? What about the windows? The decoration? All of those are elements that we talked about really extensively last week with Gothic cathedrals. So I don't want to repeat all of it here, but compare this to that. Because it's very similar, but it's also quite different. And try to articulate in your notes what the differences are. So that will conclude our week 14 lecture looking at late medieval Italy. I know we looked at a lot of different things, and I took a little bit of a different tack this week, asking you to respond to questions in your notes instead of just feeding you all of the information. That obviously will need to be supplemented by your reading material, which hopefully all of that is coming together for you. So I'm hoping that that slightly different technique in the lecture, where I'm having you compare and contrast in your notes this different style, will help you understand what's going on in this time period. It's a time period of tremendous shift and change, and we're going to see dramatic changes in the style, but it's not anything that's completely worked out yet. We haven't quite gotten to the Renaissance yet, but what we're seeing in late medieval Italy are the stirrings and foundations of what will become the Renaissance at a later time. So, If you have any questions or concerns, or if you need me to clarify something or anything like that, you should know where to find me. You can find my email address on the Blackboard site. Please do send me an email if you have any questions or concerns about the material. I'll be happy to talk to you about them. So with nothing else, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it, and I will talk at you next week.